Thank you, Akash, for the kind introduction. And just have a couple of quotes here. This is George Bernard Shaw when he was told that India and Britain were joined by cable. He said, that's wonderful, but what are they going to talk about? And I think today we would talk about cricket, I think, but at that time, I don't know what, And so I think that's a question that comes up whenever we talk about technology is, that what are we going to do with it? Some of the questions that came up earlier as well. And part of it, here's Nelson's quote, next one, which is that technicalities matter a lot, but the unifying vision matters even more. So we can get often very caught up in, the technical aspects of which cable and wire and whether the projector is hooking up or not, but whether do we have a broader vision about what it means for education. So I want to, first of all, start by thanking Quest Alliance for inviting me. This is kind of interesting for me because 10 years ago, I was here for the first conference, and that was a much younger me with a lot more hair. So that was sort of fun. And when I went back, that time I was at Michigan State University, went back, and there was a surprise gift for me. And that gift has actually stayed with me all 10 years. I sent an email this morning, and I said, can you send me a picture? So if you see this object here, which is this pins, you can make, you can put it on your ear. That's my ear design. Somebody sent it to me after meeting me at the conference, and I have it with me for 10 years. So it's kind of nice to have that, gift. A little bit about myself and my dream, which is to be on The Simpsons, the cartoon show. I don't know if you have seen The Simpsons, but there's this comic called Hari Kondabolu. He made a documentary called The Problem with Apu, which is the fact that in The Simpsons show, there is one Indian character, and he is as stereotypical as you can get. And so I've been arguing for many years that I should be the next character there, but I don't know. Again, I'm at Arizona State University, at the Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College. I'm Associate Dean for Scholarship and Innovation. My background, like most people growing up in India, if you were good in science and math, you ended up becoming an engineer. So I got my degree in engineering from BITS Pilani. Clearly, that was not what I wanted to be. I was interested in art and literature and science and math and everything. So I said, okay, I'm going to I'll make educational films. So I ended up in IIT Bombay, getting my degree in master's in design. Ended up playing with the computers at that time and sort of realizing that something interesting was happening with technology and learning. Ended up getting my PhD, and it was at Michigan State for a bunch of years. I'm also a parent, a husband, a member of the school board, and all the other things that we all are, right? I head this thing called the Office of Scholarship and Innovation at Arizona State, the Teachers College. So a couple of things that we work on there is that supporting faculty research. The pieces I'm going to talk a little bit about are around this creating digital solutions for learning, and more recently the work that we are doing, which is what we call hacking educational systems by design. I'm just going to tell a couple of stories. And if you know what a story is, it's a narrative. It could be fiction, so I could be making some stuff up, but hopefully some of it is true. And hopefully it'll be interesting, and you'll actually get something out of it. So some stories. So let's start with this thing that we call 21st century learning. So what is this thing called 21st century learning? So, as an academic, I go to my trusted resource, which is Google, and I type in, what is 21st century learning? I get 23 million hits in 0.23 seconds, right? And for the most part, it is about that kids today are interconnected. They have, iPods in their brains or whatever. When we talk about educators, it's like, people have to be on, social media, or they have to use Google Docs and all that kind of stuff. So I said, okay, so what is the key takeaway? I said, key takeaway is 21st century learning will depend on early 21st century technology. Like whatever is new today is what it is going to be for the next 100 years or 80 years, whatever, right? So I said, okay, let's go back to the future and look at early 20th century technology and how much of it became a part of educational technology. So again, going back to Google, I went back to 1901 to 1917, and I looked at all the cool technologies that had emerged in that time. So we had everything from radio to crayons to vacuum diode, talking motion picture, all that stuff. The one that I focused on, which is, I think, a really good educational technology, is the crayon. I mean, we still use it. Anybody from the age of 2 till 102 can use a crayon. It's a wonderful educational technology. But if we would have told you that the crayon was going to be the future of learning for the 20th century, we would be skeptical of that. So the same way, in the 21st century, we have to go beyond sort of what is the newest and shiniest thing. right? Because those things are going to change. So the question is, what do we hold on to in that? So for this reason, we did a synthesis of a whole bunch of different reports. We couldn't do all of 23 million Google hits, but we did look at 15 different documents, manuscripts, and so on. And we had, at Michigan State, a very high-tech system for doing qualitative analysis, and it looks like this. So basically, we cut everything up, and then we argued about how these things sort together. And we came up with three big ideas. So if you look at 21st century learning, three key things come to mind. One is what we call foundational knowledge. Okay? So that is going to be knowledge, core content knowledge, physics, chemistry, math, art, music, the subjects that we have, right? But also cross-discipline knowledge that cuts across the disciplines, and a foundational is going to be digital and ITC literacy, something that has been mentioned earlier today as well. The second piece is how we act on that knowledge, so what we call meta-knowledge, and that is things like creativity and innovation, problem-solving and critical thinking, communications and collaboration. And the final thing that emerged, what we call humanistic knowledge, which is things like life and job skills, ethical and emotional awareness, and cultural competence. Now you can see that, one, the foundational is what we need to know. The meta is how we act on that knowledge, and the humanistic is how we bring a set of values to that process. One cannot have any of these without the other two. Because if you just have foundational knowledge without a value system, you will have no way of knowing what we should learn and what we shouldn't, what should be part of the curriculum, what we shouldn't be. If you focus just on creativity and innovation and not think about foundational knowledge, what are you going to be creative about? To be a creative mathematician or a creative musician requires you to really know mathematics, know music, right? So that's, I think, an important piece to think about. So what does this, at some level, this diagram mean for educators? At one level, I think it means that nothing has changed. You could go back 100 years and tell an educator or a teacher that time is that your job is three main things. Foundational knowledge, how we act on that knowledge, and some values that you bring to it. They would nod their heads. They'd be like, yep, you're right. That is what we do. So at some level, nothing has changed. But it's also important to understand the context and the world that we live in today, right? Whether it's things like social media, whether it's all these devices and all of these things going on. And within those devices, the apps that allow us to do so many different things. And so one can argue that we have gone from that mobile device from 2000 BC to something that we can hold in our hands again today. But we also live in a very strange world. We live in a world where more people have cell phones than toilets. I mean, that just never ceases to blow me away. That as a species, that has been our priority, is to focus on giving people these little stupid devices at some level. We call them smartphones, as opposed to toilets, right? So in some ways, even though nothing has changed, some levels, everything has changed. And so a lot of my work has been around this area of technology and education, and what is it that educators need to know. And I have to introduce a very crucial character in this journey, this gentleman by the name of Matt Kaler. So that's him, that's me. He is actually very good looking, with glasses, without sunglasses. And we had, I think, what I call the ideal partnership, and I used to give the analogy of a hot air balloon, all right? So for a hot air balloon, you need two things. You need hot air, and you need a ballast. That's how you sort of balance and, fly. And the way this partnership worked was I was the hot air. I was the guy who would get these ideas, and I would run around. I'd be very excited and jumpy, and Matt was my ballast. He would hold me down to the ground. Between us, we did some really good work together, particularly sort of thinking about what is this thing called technology in the first place, okay? And understanding that technology is way more than these devices or things that we have around us, that they're deeply embedded in sort of social practice, and I'll come back to that over and over again. But here is this great thing which everybody in India will fully understand, is this idea of a missed call, right? What a concept. And it has its own Wikipedia page. Turned out it's there in different countries. It's called missed call, I think in Indonesia. But to understand the idea of a missed call, you have to understand the socioeconomic status of a country. It makes no sense for people in the US that why would you give a missed call? But when a incoming call used to cost money, it made a huge difference. So understanding the nature or the meaning of a tool or a device has to be contextualized within this broader sort of context, right? So that's really important. So there is nothing inherent or there are some things inherent in it, but not completely. So it becomes actually a question of framing. How do we frame this idea of technology and educational technology? Because how we frame things changes how we see, how we invest money, what kind of choices and decisions we make. And one of the things that we would that Matt and I would argue very strongly against is what we call a technocentric frame, which puts technology in the center of all the discussion, right? So we question technocentrism from a variety of ways. So one is how quickly technology changes, right? And if technology is changing so fast, and you can see here, from agriculture, from speech to agriculture, this is sort of when we become human, took so many generations, but if you look here, you see how fast this change is happening. And if we have a technocentric frame which says this tool is the essential thing, 5 years from now, it's going to be out of date. So really what we need to be training people for, I think what sort of Akash talked about, are mindsets and approaches that allow them to continue to learn. And if you think about somebody sat in Harvard in the dorm and created a thing called Facebook. Somebody else came up with this thing called Twitter. And they were used in the Arab Spring. That was not something that they thought that would be used for. And now we have Russian intervention in elections and all that kind of stuff going on. Completely unpredicted consequences of these technologies. But because they're embedded within broader social and political and socioeconomic context, which we have to factor in, we need to sort of rethink how we think about technology and educational technology. And the question we ask again is, what is an educational technology? These are all these different things, everything from a crayon to a book to a magnifying glass. If you have weak eyesight, a magnifying glass is an educational technology. To a CD-ROM, to a video game, and so on. Right? What Matt and I argued that there is no such thing really as an educational technology. That there are all these tools and technologies out there that we as educators have to rethink and repurpose for our needs. How many people have you seen who walk around with a scientific calculator? Very few. And the reason is because it's a single function device. But all of us have these smartphones in our pockets, which can also be a scientific calculator, which can also be a whole bunch of different tools, because there is an app for that. But when I talk to teachers about the fact that every child could have a device, one of the things they talk about is loss of control. And when they talk about loss of control, they often mean that I might be teaching the Pythagorean theorem and some kid is watching YouTube, somebody is texting. But to me, that's not real loss of control. Because that you can have rules about, you can set up filters, you can block stuff, all of that. Real loss of control as an educator is when you're teaching the Pythagorean theorem, some kid has found another proof for the theorem that you don't know. Right? There's a reason why you think you are in front, because you have all the knowledge. But guess what? Knowledge now is getting distributed in very interesting kinds of ways. So the problem, I think, for educational technology is that most technologies are not designed for educational purposes, right? Whether it's Microsoft Word or Excel or Google Docs or some special app or whatever, it's rarely, if ever, designed specially for your classroom, for what you do. But one of the great things that we do is we redefine technologies. We take technologies and use them in ways that they were not intended for. We'll take a chair and prop open the door with it. Great way, right? So my favorite example is email. How many of you have sent an email to yourself? Very strange people there. But we do it, right? You want to send a file to yourself at home, you want to keep a record of something, whatever. But email was not designed to be an archive, was not designed to be a self-whatever device. But we use it very effortlessly. And so this is important. This idea of repurposing, or what would we jugaad, is important because only repurposing makes a technology an educational technology. If there's one thing I want you guys to take away, this is a key idea I want you guys to take away. Right? And so because that's how we are continuously, as educators, seeing the world in sort of new ways. So, here's something like Twitter. What educational purpose can it have? I've used it in my classes where, as students are reading, they are supposed to tweet with certain hashtags about what they're reading. Suddenly, reading, instead of becoming a solitary activity, becomes a communal activity. Because they can tweet about some quote or something that struck them, and you start having this sort of side conversation, which can only enrich the discussion that's happening in the classroom. Right? So that's what we call like a microblogging back channel. The other reason to sort of be concerned with technocentrism is that it forgets or ignores the importance of content, subject matter, and how we teach, right? So it's important to understand that technology changes how we teach. Just this, to me, is the greatest educational technology ever. The fact that at our fingertips today is more knowledge than was ever accessible in the entire history of human civilization. That should just blow our brains away every minute. Of course, people say, oh, you can't trust some of this, who's vetting it, this, that, and the other. So that brings us to digital literacy and what I call Punya's 23rd law of parenting, which is as follows: for facts, go to Google; for wisdom, come to me. Right? So as educators, our role switches there. We are no longer people who purvey facts. We are people who forgive way of interpreting facts, of making sense of facts, of questioning facts, and forming our own understanding of it. And if you think about technology and its role in education, you have things like open, courseware. We have Khan Academy. I'll talk a little bit more about Mr. Khan in a little bit. We have Web 2.0 and user-generated content. We have people bringing devices to school. We have all these apps. We have these strange creatures called MOOCs, massively online open courses. So clearly, technology is changing how we teach. It is part of this ecology, so to speak. But it also changes what we teach. If you look at any form of human activity, I have a friend who's an astrophysicist. I don't think he's looked in a telescope for like 10 years or 20 years. He gets lots of data from Hubble, and he does all kinds of mathematical analysis of it and comes up with representations of it. If you look at the music industry, everything from how music is created to shared to sold and bought and heard dramatically changed because of technology. This is the periodic table of elements. And this set of elements is at the bottom. Ideally, they should be this way, but you will never see this representation in the textbook. And the reason is because the page becomes too long, so they put it down. So the technology of print constrained how we think about the periodic table, right? But there are hundreds of different representations of the periodic table which never make it to textbooks. There's a 3D version, spiral versions, all kinds of versions. And now you can go online, and there are apps which allow you to navigate across these different versions. That changes how we interact and engage with the ideas of chemistry. So technology changes how and what. And where does this happen? It happens in particular contexts. So if you're in a school where every child has a laptop, that's a different context if you're in 5th grade to teach photosynthesis than if you're in this classroom in Nagpur, right? Where there's a computer lab, you go for 30 minutes in a day. The way the teacher would teach photosynthesis or use technology for that would be different. Or this classroom where kids have these devices where they can walk around and take pictures. So what I've talked about so far is technology, pedagogy, and content, these three things. And the most important way that they overlap is where they come together. And this, when we wrote about it back in 2006, I think, we called it the TPCK framework, which is that as educators, we are at the intersection of technology, pedagogy, and content. And everybody sort of wondered how you pronounce something which has no vowels in it. So they said, is it the toothpick framework? So if you have watched Wheel of Fortune, you can buy a vowel for $50 or something like that. So we bought a vowel and we called it the TPAC framework. And that's sort of like the total package of what it means when you're teaching with technology, whether you're using a slate or a computer or the web. What you're doing as an educator, you are bringing together technology, pedagogy, and content together. So since I mentioned Khan Academy, I do want to have a brief digression about Khan Academy because a lot of people talk about Khan Academy. So the question I had is, how does Salman Khan learn something? Right? He wants us, we know how he wants us to learn, but how does he learn something? So I found this interview on Charlie Rose.
Napoleon and the French Revolution. What do you do? How do you prepare? What's the process of going from, I'm curious about Napoleon, to, this is what I have to teach you. This is your access to understand this moment in history.
Yeah, and so once again, I approach it from what my brain would like to see. Like, what would the ideal, and for me, in history in particular, and I don't feel like I got this in the history books. And even now when I prepare, I'm not getting it from the history books on my shelf. Is like, I like to see a scaffold. I like to see a map. I like to, what is the Holy Roman Empire? Like, what is that now?
Oh,
like
the Ottoman Empire.
The
Yeah,
Ottoman.
right.
What are these things? People can just keep referring to them, but if I can't. So I like to. So what I do is, for history, I immerse myself in as much as possible. I usually read Wikipedia entry first, just to get.
So it's a longish video. I'm not go through all of it, but here are some of the things that he talks about. He says he immerses himself. So you heard that part. He scaffolds. He looks up the stuff and he annotates a lot of stuff. And he says, however long it takes. If it takes me a week to understand Holy Roman Empire or cell division, so be it. He makes intuitive connections, tries to understand why. He makes analogies. Sometimes he has questions, so he calls up his friends and he asks obvious questions to all that information. And then a very crucial thing, he creates a video and he puts it out there on the web and people critique it and he's like, oh, I got that part wrong, so he goes back and fixes it. So this is a nice involved process that Salman Khan uses for himself to learn. And how does he recommend everybody and their kids learn? Is watch the video. Is there a problem with this or not? I find it very, very paradoxical, honestly. That here is the entire process that he goes through to learn something, and he expects that others can learn it just by watching the video without engaging in that same deep way with the content. And think about all the different technologies that he's using in order to learn that. He's going on Wikipedia, he's cutting and pasting, he's making this video, he's calling up people, all that kind of stuff. So that's very interesting to me. So the question to ask ourselves is, what does this example tell us? Would they have been possible 100 years ago, 10, 5 years? And what will be possible 5 years from now? So when we think about technology and learning, I think we need to learn to see technology in sort of new ways. We need to see it for how it fits with this pedagogy and content. And that's where sort of the creativity of the teacher comes in, the educator comes in. So it's going beyond the artifact, the tool, of seeing through it in some ways. So start thinking of processes and experiences, not just the tool. Because as John Dewey said, the belief that all education comes through experience does not mean that all experiences are genuinely or equally educative. So our role as educators, as trainers, or whatever it is that we do, is to think of how can these experiences we design be educative. So I'm making a step move here, right? I'm going from talking about artifacts to processes to experiences. And as William James said, psychology, science, and teaching is an art. And that it requires an intermediary inventive mind. And the intermediary inventive mind is you as the educator, as the designer of the curriculum. And that's where we need creativity. But some of the elements that we make sure that are in these experiences, that they're unified, that they're not fragmented. I think Akash talked about that bicycle analogy, right? Like school very often is fragmented. You do one thing, you do another thing, you do another thing. You have no idea how this connects with that. I remember my daughter telling me when she went to high school, she said, oh, the math that we're doing actually makes, like it is useful in physics. I said, wow, that took like 10 years or 11 years of school to make that. I mean, that's horrible. And she comes from a family where, people are talking about learning and this, that, and the other, and still it did not make sense, right? So unified. And when you're talking about technology, like pedagogy and content have to work together. There has to be creativity involved. We are giving people assignments and activities which push them to create things, to build things. And what we call deep play. So there is this sense of play, or exploration that comes with that. And finally, this is sort of what I call the aesthetic aspect of teaching. Very often, we don't know how to talk about things like beauty and so on in our teaching. But if you talk to scientists, if you talk to mathematicians, they talk about proofs as being elegant, as being beautiful, ideas being ugly. We have very often never been able to bring that into the conversation. So that's something that we try to think about when you're designing an experience, that it needs to have that dramatic quality. So I hide a lot of information from my students. They don't know what's coming up next, right? It's playing with them. But it is for a dramatic purpose so that it builds into something bigger. So that's how you're thinking about sort of experiences. So this is where I was, let's say, a few years back. And I felt that something was sort of missing from this story, right? So I've been doing all this work on EdTech. I've been doing all this stuff. The TPAC stuff is picking up and all that. It's all good. I get invited to come to places like this and talk to all of you. That's awesome. And then there was this whole thing about that when we talk about EdTech, there is this recurring cycle of hype and despair, right? So here's a quote about the internet, which is the introduction of the use of the internet may prove to be an event as epochal as the application of the wheel or steam power. So the internet is going to be bigger than those two things. The thing is that I lied. The quote was not about the internet. Can anybody guess what that quote was about? Any guess? Which technology, specific one? Print, not bad. It's actually 1933, and it was about the motion picture, right? That was the prediction, that this would, and I have lots of quotes like this, of like people making all these awesome quotes about predictions about how technology can transform stuff, right? And so the question I kept asking is, why has EdTech not transformed education? What has been holding it back? And that's where I sort of started thinking that we need to go beyond artifacts, process, and experience to start thinking about systems and culture. And that's what brings in this idea of design. And I happen to be now at Arizona State University for the last 2 years. Before that, I was at Michigan State. So I'm at the Teachers College, and part of what we're involved in is sort of completely reimagining what teacher preparation looks like, what the educator workforce would be. So one of the questions we're asking is that why do we have this model still of one adult with 30 kids, 40 kids, 10 kids, 15 kids, whatever? Why can't there be more adults who come in and out of the classroom as and when needed? So we are sort of working on these models and sort of looking at, through the Office of Scholarship Innovation, by looking at this idea of innovation by design. And so the big part of what I do these days is what I call community design labs. These are partnerships between the teacher college and different educational institutions. These are collaborative efforts to design innovative solutions to what we call wicked problems in education. We don't come in with the problem, we don't come in with the solution. We work collaboratively with you in different diverse teams so that you identify what it is that you care about. And then we scaffold that process. And we see this as a professional learning community for educators. That is not just you came up with a solution to this immediate problem, but you came up with strategies that you can now apply to other wicked problems down the road in your organization, in your life. And we call these wicked problems for a reason, because these are problems who attack back. And there's a great quote from Pete Hine, which is, problems worthy of attack prove their worth by hitting back. So that is why some of these things around education are very difficult and intractable, because they're wicked problems, that they are never, ever going to be fully solved. That's why we always continuously have to engage with them. And I don't want to go into the whole definition of a wicked problem and so on. We can talk about that. But what we are doing is trying to build models of design which allow us to understand context. And the first step actually is building relationships. So before even we start working with any district, I spend a lot of time talking to the leadership, talking to the teachers, just a lot of conversation and discussion before we even start the first session. And so we are sort of building this model. We're trying to build a network of these, again, because of the value of the network effects, because what might be a problem for your school, engaging in the discussion with another group, you will get newer ideas. Both groups will benefit from it. And so we are sort of trying to build that out. And most importantly, we are trying to do that within our organization as well. This is one which is just starting out. This one is really exciting because this one is we are trying to design a school for the future. We have no idea. It will be like a 3-year project as far as we can see. We have just started working on it. And again, bringing, so we did, all the people in the design team did a shadow a student for the day. So they spent the entire day doing everything that the student does. How many of you have tried something like that? Excellent. It's a brain-opening exercise, because you realize what students are actually going, how much time they're made to sit, how much disciplinary imposition is on them, and all of that stuff, right? So we're just at the beginning stages of that. So with this idea of sort of thinking about, sort of unpacking this idea of design, and Herbert Simon said the proper study of mankind is the study of design. And so a large part of our focus has been on that. This is, A definition of design is everyone who devises courses of action aimed at changing existing situations into preferred ones. That's what all of us are involved in. Whatever we have around us, we want to make it better. And even this kid who's spitting the food out is making his life better by spitting the food out. So this kid is also a designer. That's the point I was trying to make. But the important insight that I got, like why this past years of my life of working with artifacts and working with processes and working with experiences was not enough, is in this quote by Alan Kay. The key idea there is that architecture dominates material. Okay, which means the culture of the place, the structure, the systems dominate all the other things that we might be trying to do. So if we want to make change happen, it has to happen at the systems and the culture level. It's a great quote. So it's as with most media from which things are built, whether the thing is a cathedral, a bacterium, a sonnet, a figure, or a word processor, architecture dominates material. To understand clay is not to understand the pot. What a pot is all about can be appreciated better by understanding the creators and users of the pot and the need to inform the material with meaning and abstract meaning from the form. So just as this cell phone, the idea of the missed call within that, right, can only be understood by understanding people involved in it and the social context within which it functions. So one of the things that we've been working on, so I have to, if you think back about the narrative that I'm building, is this idea of artifacts that my background in engineering and design, that's what I was focused on. Then with the TPAC work and so on and the teaching, it's like thinking about processes, curriculum, and so on. Then thinking about how do we design experiences which are powerful learning experiences for students. And I think the work that I'm involved in now is happening at the level of systems and culture. And it's interesting to see that what happens when we go from this to this, you're just increasing complexity, right? Problems at this end can be ill-structured. Some of them may even be properly structured that you can look up a book and find the answer. But by the time you reach the right, things are completely wicked. It's also important to understand that there is a conversation that's bidirectional, right? So if you look at the example that I give is of Twitter. When Twitter first came out, they didn't have hashtag, they didn't have the @ symbol. Users created that. So that was something that bubbled up, right? Missed call is another example of that. So you'll find lots of examples of technology where it's both top-down and bottom-up. So understanding systems change requires you to understand this stuff in between. You cannot do that. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I think so many of our policy initiatives fail. Because we are working in this abstract level of policy and not understanding what's happening at this level. Or, as I did for most of my career, sit at this level and not understand that the issues are much bigger, right? So clearly, as we think about these things, we need to start thinking of new organizations, new ways of learning, new roles, and I think most importantly, new mindsets. Because we create who we are. And as John Cleese said, creativity is not a talent, it is a way of operating. So we need to create these organizations which are learning organizations. And this quote, I think, to me, is about individual learning, but applies as much, I think, to organizational learning. So learning is least useful when it is private and hidden. It is most powerful when it becomes public and communal. So as we think about the organization that we work in, as we think about these new technologies and the power of networking that we have, we can start thinking of new ways of structuring organization so that our learning and this meeting is an example of that, right? What we are trying to do is make what we know, what we have learned, make it public and communal. Sum up. So to sum up, we live in a new ecology where there are no standard solutions. It is about creativity, and we get there not through magic, but by the purposeful process of design. It is not about the technology, and yet it is in some weird way about the technology. Talked a little bit about this, which is technology, pedagogy, and content coming together. understanding that at some level nothing has changed, but another level everything has changed in the world that we live in. Talked about this sort of 5 discourses of design as it plays out in education. Talked about sort of the art and craft of teaching. So can people read that? Sort of? Read that? Science, okay, so art and science becomes education. I want to end with 2 photographs. So this is photographs taken of my kids the first day of school and the last day of school when they graduated. So that's my daughter, and that's my son. And if you look at their faces the first day of school, they look so sad. Because they know for the next 12 years, it's not going to be very much fun. Look at their faces when they're leaving school. They're like, finally. And I think that is such a tragic sort of, and they went to pretty good schools and all of that stuff. But that is, I think, the big tragedy that we have sort of perpetuated on our children, is that we've made this thing which should be, needs to be, inherently is exciting and fun and powerful and world-changing. Such a drudgery. And if there's one thing that I want you guys to take is that how do we get that bliss, that glee, that joy of learning back into what we do? Because if we do that, I think a lot of these things that we struggle with actually will become at least more fun as we're doing it. And hopefully we leave it better than what we found it. Thank you so much.